I thought the hardest day of my life would be the day I buried my husband. For 17 years, Marcus Ellington had been the center of my world. He wasn't perfect. No marriage survives nearly 2 decades without arguments, disappointments, and difficult seasons. But he had been my partner, my best friend, the man who sat beside me through family emergencies, celebrated promotions with me, held my hand through surgeries, and kissed me goodbye every morning before leaving for work. When the doctors told me his heart attack had been massive and that there was nothing they could do, it felt as though someone had ripped the foundation out from beneath my entire life. The funeral passed in a blur of flowers, black clothing, casseroles from neighbors, and endless condolences. People filled the church with stories about Marcus's kindness. Business associates praised his integrity. Friends spoke about his generosity. Family members cried as they remembered holidays, vacations, and milestones shared with him over the years. I stood beside his casket feeling numb, listening to everyone describe a man I thought I knew completely. Looking back now, that may have been the cruelest part of all. While everyone celebrated the life he had lived, none of us knew how much of it had been built on lies. The days immediately after the funeral were strangely quiet. Once the visitors stopped coming and the sympathy cards stopped arriving, I found myself alone inside a house that suddenly felt much too large. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of Marcus. His reading glasses sat on the nightstand beside our bed. His favorite coffee mug remained in the kitchen cabinet. His jacket still hung near the front door, where he had left it before going to work that final morning. Grief has a way of turning ordinary objects into emotional landmines. One moment you're reaching for a plate, and the next you're crying because you found a receipt in his handwriting tucked inside a drawer. 3 days after the funeral, I decided to organize his office. Part of me hoped the task would keep my mind occupied. Marcus had always been meticulous about paperwork, and there were insurance documents, financial records, and business files that needed attention. I spent most of the afternoon sorting through filing cabinets, labeling folders, and trying not to think about how much I missed him. Everything seemed normal at first. Tax records, investment statements, mortgage paperwork, the predictable documents accumulated during a long marriage. Then I opened the bottom drawer of his desk. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. The drawer contained old notebooks, office supplies, and several folders I hadn't seen before. It wasn't until I moved one of the notebooks that I spotted a black smartphone tucked against the back panel. My first assumption was that it belonged to work. Marcus occasionally handled confidential projects for clients, and I figured it might be a secondary business phone he had forgotten to mention. There was nothing suspicious about that. At least, that's what I told myself. Then, the phone started ringing. The sound startled me so badly that I nearly dropped it. The screen lit up immediately, displaying a photograph of a smiling little girl with dark curls and bright eyes. For a moment, I simply stared at it, confused. I didn't recognize her. None of our relatives had children who looked like that. Before I could process what I was seeing, a message notification appeared beneath the picture. "Daddy, Mommy says, are you coming tonight?" My entire body froze. I read the message once, then again, then a third time. Each time, the words seemed more impossible. Daddy, Mommy, coming home? The room suddenly felt too small, too hot. My heart began pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the phone belonged to a friend. Maybe Marcus had been helping someone. Maybe there was some perfectly reasonable answer that would make all of this make sense. But deep down, a terrible feeling had already begun spreading through my chest. The phone contained hundreds of messages. Thousands, actually. Photos, videos, conversations stretching back years.
and every single one of them pointed toward the same horrifying truth. Marcus wasn't helping another family. Marcus was part of another family. I sat at his desk for nearly 2 hours reading messages I never should have had to read. Birthday plans, vacation photos, school events, holiday celebrations, doctor appointments, ordinary family moments. The kind of moments that belong to a husband and father. The kind of moments Marcus had apparently been living with someone else, while coming home to me every night.
I discovered her name within minutes. Celeste. The messages between them weren't casual. They weren't secretive. They weren't the language of an affair. They were the language of a committed relationship. 12 years of conversations. 12 years of promises. 12 years of lies. By the time I finally put the phone down, I was shaking so violently that I could barely stand. Every memory from the last decade suddenly looked different. Business trips, late-night meetings, weekends he claimed he was helping friends, conferences that lasted longer than expected, events he attended alone because he insisted spouses weren't invited. All those missing pieces suddenly fit together, and the picture they created was devastating. Eventually, I found an address saved under a simple contact name. Home. Not our home. Another home. A different home. The funeral flowers were still sitting in my living room when I picked up my car keys. I should have waited. I should have called someone. I should have given myself time to think. Instead, I drove. 40 minutes later, I pulled into a quiet neighborhood lined with trees and well-kept houses. The address led me to a beautiful 2-story home with a swing hanging from the front porch. Children's bicycles rested near the driveway. Toys were scattered across the lawn. It looked like the kind of place where families built memories together. The kind of place where Marcus apparently built an entire second life. For several minutes, I sat in my car staring at the house.
Then I forced myself to walk to the front door. I knocked once. My heart felt like it might explode. A few seconds later, the door opened, and the woman standing there looked just as shocked to see me as I was to see her. At that moment, I knew one thing immediately. She hadn't known about me either. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. We simply stared at each other across the doorway, 2 strangers connected by a man who had spent years making sure our worlds would never collide. The woman standing in front of me looked nothing like the villain I had imagined during the drive over. She wasn't glamorous or manipulative. She wasn't some calculating mistress who knowingly helped destroy another woman's marriage. She looked exhausted, confused, vulnerable. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes, and her expression carried the same grief that had been following me since Marcus died. Before either of us said a word, I realized something that made my stomach twist even harder. Whatever this woman was guilty of, she wasn't guilty of knowing about me. Her gaze shifted to the phone in my trembling hand. The moment she recognized it, all the color drained from her face. I watched her eyes widen in disbelief, then fear, then something far worse, recognition. She knew that phone. She knew exactly who it belonged to. For a moment, it looked as though she might collapse right there in the doorway. One hand instinctively moved toward the frame for support, while the other pressed against her chest. It was the same expression I had seen in my own mirror countless times over the previous 3 days. The expression of someone realizing their reality had just been ripped apart.
My name is Amelia Ellington, I finally said, forcing the words past the tightness in my throat. I was married to Marcus for 17 years. The silence that followed felt endless. Behind her, I could hear the faint sound of a television playing somewhere inside the house.
Children's laughter drifted through the hallway. Ordinary sounds. Everyday sounds. The kind of sounds that should have belonged to a normal family living a normal life. Instead, they felt surreal against the weight of the truth standing between us. The woman continued staring at me, as though she couldn't process what she had heard. Then tears immediately filled her eyes. "No," she whispered. It wasn't denial. It was devastation. She wasn't arguing with me. She was arguing with reality itself. I slowly held out the phone. Her hands shook as she took it from me. For several moments, she simply stared at the screen. Then she looked up at me again, and I saw the exact moment her remaining hope disappeared. Whatever explanation she had been searching for died right there. The truth was unavoidable now. Marcus hadn't been living one life. He had been living two. And somehow, he had managed to convince both of us that we were the only woman he loved.
The woman swallowed hard before finally speaking. "My name is Celeste." Her voice cracked. "We've been together for 12 years. The words hit me harder than I expected. 12 years. Not 12 months, not a brief affair, not a temporary betrayal. 12 years. More than a decade of birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, family photographs, and promises. 12 years of memories built on a foundation of deception. As painful as it was hearing the number spoken aloud, part of me appreciated the honesty. Neither of us had the energy for lies anymore. Marcus had already provided enough deception for all of us. Celeste eventually stepped aside and quietly invited me inside. Under normal circumstances, entering another woman's home would have felt deeply uncomfortable. Instead, it felt strangely inevitable. The house was beautiful, in a way that immediately revealed Marcus's influence. Certain furniture pieces matched things he had once pointed out in stores. The artwork reflected the same tastes he claimed were uniquely his. Family photographs lined the walls, and every few steps felt like walking into another version of my own life. There were vacation pictures, holiday gatherings, birthday celebrations, smiling memories frozen in frames. Marcus appeared in almost all of them. My husband, co-partner, their father. The same man, the same smile, the same eyes, the same lies.
Eventually, we sat across from each other at the dining room table, while the children remained upstairs, unaware that their lives were changing forever. Neither of us seemed to know where to begin. How do you have a conversation like this? How do you explain years of betrayal when you're still trying to understand it yourself? Every question seemed impossible. Every answer seemed worse. Yet somehow, over the next several hours, we began comparing pieces of our lives. What emerged was horrifying. Whenever Marcus told me he was traveling for work, he was often with Celeste and the children. Whenever he claimed he was attending conferences, he frequently spent those days at this house. Certain holidays he supposedly worked through were actually spent celebrating with them. And just as shockingly, there were times when he disappeared from their lives to be with me. Marcus hadn't maintained a second relationship. He had maintained a second existence. The deeper we talked, the more impossible his deception seemed. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Calendars matched, dates aligned, stories overlapped. Every missing piece fit perfectly into place. It became painfully clear that Marcus had spent years carefully managing schedules, excuses, and expectations to keep both families separated. The amount of planning required was almost as disturbing as the betrayal itself. As evening approached,
2 children cautiously entered the room. The little girl from the phone stood beside her mother. An older boy remained slightly behind her. The moment I saw their faces, my chest tightened, because there was no denying who their father was. Marcus stared back at me through both of them. And suddenly, for the first time since discovering the truth, I realized this story wasn't only about 2 betrayed women anymore. There were children involved. Children who had just lost their father. Children who had absolutely no idea that everything they believed about their family was about to be shattered. And as I looked into their confused eyes, another terrible realization began forming. Marcus hadn't only left behind secrets, he had left behind consequences. Consequences that neither of us fully understood yet. And within the next few weeks, we would discover just how devastating those consequences truly were.
The weeks that followed felt less like grieving and more like surviving a disaster whose full scale was still unfolding. Every morning seemed to bring another discovery, another unanswered question, another piece of information that made Marcus's deception appear even larger than it had the day before. The shock of finding his second family had barely begun to settle when practical realities started demanding attention. Bills needed to be paid, accounts needed to be reviewed, legal paperwork needed signatures. Grief rarely waits for convenience, and neither do financial obligations. While I was still struggling to understand how my husband had managed to live 2 separate lives, I found myself buried beneath documents that revealed just how complicated those lives had become. At first, I wanted nothing to do with Celeste, not because I blamed her, but because every interaction reminded me of the betrayal. Seeing her face meant confronting the reality that Marcus had shared parts of himself with someone else for more than a decade. Yet the deeper we dug into his affairs, the more obvious it became that neither of us could navigate the situation alone. Marcus had intertwined our lives in ways that extended far beyond emotions. Financial records connected properties neither of us fully understood. Insurance policies referenced beneficiaries we didn't recognize. Loans appeared against assets we believed were debt-free. The more paperwork we uncovered, the clearer it became that Marcus had left behind a maze designed by years of secrecy.
3 weeks after our first meeting, Celeste and I found ourselves sitting together in the office of an estate attorney. The room was quiet, except for the occasional turning of pages and the hum of an air conditioner struggling against the summer heat outside. The attorney looked increasingly uncomfortable as he reviewed the documents spread across his desk. Several times he removed his glasses, rubbed his forehead, and reread sections as though hoping the numbers would somehow change. They never did. By the end of the meeting, his expression told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "I'm afraid there are significant complications," he finally said. That sentence became the theme of the entire year. Significant complications. It turned out Marcus's finances were nowhere near as stable as either of us had believed. The successful businessman we thought we knew had been maintaining an illusion for years. Behind the polished image, expensive suits, and confident smiles was a man drowning in obligations he could no longer manage. Several business ventures were operating at substantial losses. Multiple loans had been taken out against properties. Investment accounts were far smaller than they appeared. Worse still, certain assets had been pledged as collateral more than once. The deeper professionals examined his records, the uglier the picture became.
The most painful revelation arrived during a meeting with a forensic accountant. I remember sitting in a conference room, surrounded by spreadsheets and financial summaries, while he carefully explained how Marcus had managed to support 2 households for so long. The answer wasn't intelligence or extraordinary success. It was debt. Massive amounts of debt. Credit lines, personal loans, refinancing agreements, and risky investments had allowed him to maintain appearances long after reality should have caught up with them. He hadn't been funding two families through wealth. He had been funding them through borrowed time. For several moments after hearing that explanation, neither Celeste nor I spoke. The silence wasn't caused by surprise anymore. By that point, surprise had become impossible. Instead, it was exhaustion. Every new discovery seemed determined to destroy another piece of the man we thought we knew. Marcus hadn't simply lied about relationships. He had lied about stability, security, and the future. The life he presented to both families had been built on foundations already beginning to collapse. Had he lived another few years, the truth likely would have surfaced on its own. His death hadn't created the crisis. It had merely exposed it. What happened next surprised me more than anything else. Rather than turning against one another, Celeste and I began working together. At first, the cooperation felt awkward. We were strangers, connected by heartbreak. But as weeks turned into months, something unexpected developed between us. We understood each other's pain in ways nobody else could. Friends and relatives offered sympathy, but they couldn't truly grasp what it felt like to discover that years of memories had been built on deception. Only the two of us understood the unique devastation of learning that the person we loved had never fully belonged to either family.
Together, we began untangling the mess Marcus left behind. We reviewed records late into the night. We met with attorneys, accountants, and financial advisors. We sold properties that could no longer be maintained. We negotiated settlements and payment plans. There were days when the stress felt unbearable. Days when one of us would break down crying halfway through a meeting. Days when anger overwhelmed sadness, and all we could talk about was the betrayal. Yet somehow, progress continued. Slowly, painfully, but steadily. The children became our greatest motivation. Every difficult decision ultimately came back to them. Elias and Noelle had already lost their father. Neither Celeste nor I could bear the thought of them losing their home, their education, or their sense of stability as well. The more time I spent around them, the harder it became to view them as symbols of Marcus's deception. They were innocent victims, just like we were. They hadn't asked to be born into secrets. They hadn't chosen any of this. They deserved protection, not resentment. Then, nearly 4 months after the funeral, we uncovered something that changed everything. Hidden among Marcus's business records was evidence of transactions neither of us recognized. Large sums of money had been moving through accounts connected to one of his companies. The amounts were substantial enough to attract attention, yet there was very little documentation explaining their purpose. At first, we assumed it was another example of poor record keeping. But the more closely experts examined the transfers, the more concerning they appeared. What began as a search for answers about our future suddenly became something much larger. Because for the first time, it looked as though Marcus's secrets extended beyond his family's, and whatever he had been hiding was serious enough that other people might come looking for it. The discovery of the hidden transactions changed the entire direction of our investigation. Until that point, everything we had uncovered, no matter how painful, had remained personal. Marcus had betrayed 2 families. He had lied about his finances. He had created a life built on deception and debt. Those revelations were devastating, but they belonged to us. They were family wounds, private tragedies. The mysterious transfers buried within his business accounts felt different. They carried an entirely different weight. For the first time, it seemed possible that Marcus had been hiding secrets from more than just the people who loved him. The forensic accountant assigned to review the records requested additional documents almost immediately. What we originally believed would take a few days turned into several weeks of intensive analysis. Every new report raised more questions than it answered. The money wasn't simply disappearing. It was moving through a network of accounts connected to shell companies, consulting agreements, and business entities that appeared legitimate on the surface, but became increasingly suspicious when examined closely. Several transactions had no clear business purpose at all. Others seemed deliberately structured to avoid attracting attention. The professionals handling the investigation became noticeably more serious with each meeting.
One afternoon, Celeste and I sat together in a conference room while a team of accountants walked us through their findings. The atmosphere felt far different from the estate meetings we had attended earlier. Those discussions focused on debts, assets, and inheritance disputes. This meeting focused on something far more troubling. One of the accountants projected a series of financial charts onto a screen while explaining how money had moved between multiple entities over several years. Even without a financial background, I could tell the patterns weren't normal. Every explanation seemed to point toward the same conclusion. Marcus had spent years hiding financial activity from investors, lenders, and business partners. The realization was difficult to accept because it conflicted so sharply with the man I thought I knew. Marcus had always presented himself as ethical, disciplined, and responsible. He spoke constantly about reputation and integrity. He lectured younger employees about honesty. He volunteered for charitable organizations and served on community boards. Yet the evidence sitting in front of us painted a very different picture. Somewhere along the way, the image he projected had become disconnected from reality. The man celebrated at his funeral and the man revealed through these records were beginning to look like two entirely different people. As painful as those discoveries were, they also provided unexpected answers. For months, I had struggled to understand how Marcus managed to maintain two families while supporting a lifestyle that seemed increasingly expensive. The numbers finally explained it. He hadn't been succeeding. He had been borrowing. He hadn't been building stability. He had been postponing collapse. Every loan, every hidden account, and every questionable transaction bought him a little more time. The life he presented to both families wasn't sustainable. It was a carefully balanced illusion that required constant maintenance to avoid falling apart. The situation became even more serious when several former business associates started contacting attorneys involved with the estate. At first, the inquiry seemed routine. Then the questions became more specific. Certain investors wanted explanations regarding missing funds. Former partners requested access to records that couldn't be located. One lender claimed information provided during a loan application appeared inaccurate. Individually, none of the concerns seemed catastrophic. Together, they painted a deeply troubling picture. The financial problems weren't isolated mistakes. They were part of a larger pattern that had likely been developing for years.
During this period, Celeste and I spent countless hours talking about Marcus. Not the version revealed through legal documents, but the version we each remembered. We compared stories, memories, and experiences in an attempt to understand how one man could successfully compartmentalize so much of his life. Some evenings, we sat for hours discussing moments that now seemed suspicious in hindsight. Other times, we laughed at strange coincidences that only made sense after discovering the truth. There was something strangely healing about those conversations. Instead of allowing Marcus's deception to divide us, they helped us process it together. The children remained largely unaware of the financial investigation unfolding around them. That was intentional. Both Celeste and I agreed they had already endured enough upheaval. Elias was entering a difficult stage of adolescence,
and Noelle still struggled to understand why her father wasn't coming home. They deserved as much normalcy as possible. We protected them from legal meetings, financial discussions, and adult problems. Looking back, those children gave us purpose during the darkest months. Every decision we made centered on preserving their future. In many ways, they became the reason we kept moving forward when giving up would have been easier. Then came the phone call that changed everything.
It arrived late on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing documents at home. The attorney handling part of the estate sounded unusually serious. He informed me that federal investigators had requested access to certain business records connected to Marcus's company. Apparently, questions regarding several financial transactions had expanded beyond civil concerns. Authorities wanted information. They wanted documents. And most importantly, they wanted answers that Marcus was no longer alive to provide. After ending the call, I sat quietly for several minutes staring out the window. The rain tapped softly against the glass. My mind replayed everything we had uncovered during the previous months. The lies, the hidden accounts, the debts, the second family, the secret transactions, all of it. And for the first time since Marcus died, I realized something unsettling. His death hadn't ended the consequences of his choices. In many ways, those consequences were only beginning. What we would discover next wouldn't just change how we viewed his life. It would change everything we thought we knew about the man himself. The federal investigation lasted nearly 8 months. By that point, I had stopped expecting good news whenever the phone rang. Every new development seemed to reveal another layer of deception, another secret Marcus had managed to keep hidden while presenting himself as a successful businessman, devoted husband, and respected member of the community. Yet, as exhausting as the process became, I found myself strangely detached from it. The woman who discovered the second phone inside his desk drawer would have been consumed by anger and heartbreak. The woman I had become after nearly a year of uncovering lies was different. Grief had changed shape. The shock had faded. What remained was a quiet determination to finish what needed to be finished and finally move forward. The investigators eventually confirmed what the forensic accountants had suspected. Marcus had spent years concealing financial losses through increasingly risky business practices. While there was no evidence he had intended to commit large-scale fraud in the beginning, the pressure of maintaining 2 households, preserving his public image, and covering mounting debts had pushed him into decisions that became harder and harder to justify. Small compromises had evolved into larger ones. Temporary solutions became permanent habits. By the end, he had created a web of financial obligations that even he could no longer control. Ironically, the image of success he worked so hard to protect was the very thing that helped destroy him.
For a long time, I struggled with what to feel about that revelation. Part of me wanted to hate him. Some days I succeeded. Other days I remembered the man who brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, or stayed awake all night when I was sick. I remembered vacations, anniversaries, inside jokes, and moments of genuine happiness. Human beings are complicated. Marcus wasn't a monster, but he wasn't the man I believed he was either. The hardest lesson wasn't learning that he had lied. The hardest lesson was accepting that both versions of him existed simultaneously. The loving husband I remembered was real. So was the man who deceived 2 families for over a decade. Understanding that contradiction took far longer than uncovering any financial secret. Through all of it, the most unexpected part of my journey remained Celeste. If someone had told me on the day of Marcus's funeral that I would eventually consider her one of the closest people in my life, I would have thought they were insane. Yet, shared hardship has a strange way of creating bonds.
We spent countless hours navigating legal meetings, financial decisions, emotional breakdowns, and difficult conversations. Somewhere along the way, the awkwardness disappeared, the resentment disappeared, the sense of being strangers disappeared. We became something neither of us anticipated: family.
The children played a significant role in that transformation. Elias and Noelle slowly became part of my life in ways I never expected. At first, I kept my distance because I worried my presence would confuse them. But children often adapt better than adults. They asked questions when they needed answers and focused on living their lives the rest of the time. Over the months, I attended school events, birthday celebrations, and family dinners. The more time I spent with them, the more I understood that Marcus's mistakes didn't define their future. They were intelligent, kind, resilient children who deserved stability and support regardless of the circumstances that brought us together. Nearly 2 years after the funeral, I found myself sitting in the audience during Elias's middle school graduation ceremony. The gymnasium buzzed with excited families, proud parents, and nervous students preparing to move into the next stage of their education. As I watched him walk across the stage to receive his certificate, I felt an unexpected wave of emotion. Not sadness, not grief, pride. The kind of pride that comes from witnessing someone overcome difficult circumstances and continue moving forward. Beside me, Celeste wiped tears from her eyes while smiling. For a brief moment, we looked at each other and silently acknowledged how far we had come. Later that afternoon, we gathered in my backyard for a small celebration. Friends, relatives, and neighbors filled the space with laughter and conversation. Noelle ran across the lawn chasing my niece, while several adults argued playfully over a card game on the patio. The scene looked ordinary. In many ways, that was what made it extraordinary. 2 years earlier, our lives had been defined by betrayal, deception, and loss. Now, they were defined by something far healthier: peace. Not perfect peace, not complete healing, just the quiet understanding that life could continue after devastation. As the sun began setting that evening, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened since Marcus's death. If someone had offered me the opportunity to erase the entire experience, I honestly don't know what I would have chosen. The betrayal was devastating. The discoveries were painful. The grief changed me permanently. Yet hidden within that pain were lessons I never would have learned otherwise. I learned that survival often looks different than we imagine. I learned that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting. Most importantly, I learned that the people left behind after betrayal still have the power to choose what happens next. Marcus spent years controlling every narrative around him. He controlled what each family knew. He controlled what people believed. He controlled the image he presented to the world. In death, he lost that control. The truth eventually surfaced, piece by piece, until nothing remained hidden. Yet the most important part of the story wasn't the exposure of his secrets. It was what happened afterward. 2 women who had every reason to hate each other chose cooperation instead. 2 families, connected by deception, chose healing instead of conflict. The damage Marcus caused was real, but it didn't have to become the final chapter. Today, when people ask about that period of my life, I rarely talk about the lies first. I don't start with the second phone, the hidden family, or the financial scandals. Instead, I talk about resilience. I talk about rebuilding. I talk about the surprising ways people can find strength after their world falls apart. Because in the end, the funeral wasn't the worst part. Discovering the truth wasn't the worst part either. The worst part was believing,
even briefly, that the betrayal would define the rest of my life. It didn't. And that's why, standing in my backyard 2 years later, while children laughed and families celebrated, I finally understood something that had taken a very long time to learn. Marcus's secrets changed my story, but they didn't get to write the ending.
Some betrayals arrive with warning signs. Others hide behind familiar smiles, routine conversations, and years of shared memories. In this story, the greatest shock wasn't losing a husband. It wasn't even standing beside a casket, believing a chapter of life had ended. The deepest wound came afterward, when a single phone call revealed that an entire reality had been built on lies. Yet, if this story teaches us anything, it's that betrayal may change your life, but it does not have to control the rest of it. What Marcus did was unforgivable in many ways. He stole years from two women who trusted him. He created confusion where there should have been honesty, secrets where there should have been transparency, and pain where there should have been love. But the remarkable part of this story wasn't his deception. The remarkable part was what happened after the truth surfaced. Instead of allowing one man's lies to create a lifetime of bitterness, two women chose something far more powerful. They chose healing. They chose cooperation. They chose to protect innocent children rather than fight over the wreckage of the past. Life rarely gives us the endings we expect. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive in the form of revenge. Sometimes it arrives in the form of peace. It arrives when you stop allowing someone else's choices to define your future. It arrives when you realize that surviving betrayal is not about winning against the person who hurt you. It's about refusing to let their actions destroy the person you are meant to become. That lesson is what transformed this story from one of heartbreak into one of resilience. For anyone listening who has experienced betrayal, disappointment, or the collapse of a relationship you thought would last forever, remember this: the truth may hurt when it arrives, but it also sets you free. Lies require constant maintenance. Secrets require constant protection. Eventually, both become too heavy to carry. When the truth finally comes to light, it creates an opportunity to rebuild your life on something stronger than illusion. The process is painful, but it is also where healing begins. Thank you for spending time with echoes of trust and betrayals. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys powerful stories of betrayal, resilience, and redemption. And in the comments below, tell us this: if you had discovered your spouse had been living a completely separate life for years, would you have been able to work alongside the other family to rebuild? Or would the betrayal have been too great to overcome? We always love hearing your thoughts, and your stories may inspire someone else who is walking through a difficult chapter of their own. Until next time, remember, sometimes the truth arrives late, sometimes justice arrives quietly, and sometimes the people left behind discover they are far stronger than the person who betrayed them ever imagined.